I was recently talking to my dad when the Cursor acquisition came up, and somewhere in trying to explain why it mattered, I realized he'd absorbed the same story most people had, that a text editor had just sold for $60 billion. That framing isn't wrong so much as it's aimed at the wrong object. It describes the transaction and misses the transaction's reason for existing. And once you notice the gap, it's hard to unsee it in almost every AI acquisition since. Start with what's actually true. SpaceX, which folded xAI into its AI division back in February, has exercised its option to acquire Anysphere, the company behind Cursor, in an all-stock deal reported at roughly $60 billion. Cursor gets pulled in as a coding tool used daily by millions of developers, and in return gains access to xAI's Colossus compute for its own model training. On the surface, this reads like a product acquisition, a fast-growing application layer folded into a full-stack AI company. And the sum is large enough that it invites the obvious question, what is a code editor worth that someone would pay that much for it? But the editor was never the asset. Cursor runs on a fork of VS Codium, the same open-source base underneath Windsurf, underneath Google's anti-gravity, underneath Microsoft's own VS Code lineage. Forking that code base and building an agentic layer on top is real engineering, but it is not scarce engineering. Half the serious coding assistant products on the market are proof of that, built by teams with a fraction of xAI's resources. A company sitting on hundreds of thousands of GPUs in a frontier model does not lack the capability to fork VS Codium and ship a competent competitor at a cost that would barely register on its balance sheet. If the editor were the prize, this would be one of the worst-priced acquisitions in tech history. Here's where the market analogy earns its keep, because I think in this language more naturally than I think in most others. A printed price tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you why. The real information, who was defending a level, who got trapped, where the resting liquidity sat before it was swept, lives in the order flow underneath the tape. And the tape is just the residue that flow leaves behind. Everyone can see the price. Almost no one can see the flow that produced it. That asymmetry is the whole game, and it's exactly the asymmetry sitting inside this acquisition. The editor is the tape. What xAI actually bought is the order flow underneath it. Millions of developers, every day, generating a live record of intent, correction, and revision that no amount of compute can synthesize from scratch. To see why that record is suddenly the scarcest thing in AI, you have to look at what's happened to training data over the last 2 years, and it's a problem with 2 separate roots. The first is bureaucratic. The scraping everything era is closing. Privacy law and IP frameworks have caught up to the AI industry, and the open web has grown defensive, with bot blockers and access gates now standard on the properties that used to be freely crawlable. None of this makes data acquisition impossible, but it has made the easy version of it over. The second root is structural, and it's the more interesting one because it doesn't get fixed by better lawyers. As AI-generated content floods the web, the ratio of genuinely novel human signal to synthetic filler keeps shrinking, and feeding a model on its own species output doesn't neutrally dilute the training set. It degrades it. A kind of information-theoretic inbreeding where each generation reproduces the same statistical center instead of exploring around it. Nowhere is this more visible than in code. There was a version of the internet where a hard edge case sent you to Stack Overflow and returned a dozen genuinely different attempts at a solution. Different constraints, different trade-offs, different people arguing about which trade-off was correct. That variance was signal. Model outputs today are visibly converging on a narrower set of reasonable answers, and that convergence is a direct symptom of what they were trained on. Less argument, less disagreement, less of the real distribution of how people actually solve problems, and instead, a distribution that's already been through the wash of a previous model's output. Cursor's dataset sidesteps both problems at once. It isn't scraped, so none of the access or licensing pressure applies. And it isn't synthetic. It's the highest resolution trace of human correction against machine output that currently exists at scale. Millions of developers every day, accepting a suggestion, rejecting one, rewriting a third, nudging the model back onto a path it hadn't chosen on its own. That's not code. That's supervision, recorded continuously at a volume no lab could generate by paying contractors to write it by hand. I want to be specific about what that supervision actually contains, because I think even that description understates it. I've been using Claude Code since earlier this year. I wrote about the shift it caused in how I work and late to the game changed by it, and the tool is genuinely excellent. It is also, unmistakably, a blunt instrument that needs a hand on it. Ask a model to build an algorithmic trading platform for deploying live bots, and it will hand you back something that runs, built from whatever it judges to be sensible defaults given its training: a plausible stack, a plausible database, a plausible deployment path. What it won't hand you is a product anyone should trust with real capital, because plausible and correct for this specific system are not the same claim. Building Plutarch taught me this the unglamorous way, one correction at a time. Multi-repo and hexagonal architecture were never the model's first instinct. Reactive subscriptions over WebSocket weren't either. Every time I redirected it toward the actual shape the system needed, I was supplying something the model structurally cannot supply itself. A model reasons only within its context window, and a context window has no roadmap in it, no memory of where the product is going, no sense of the thing that hasn't been built yet, but is already shaping the decisions you make today. Plutarch's compute provisioning adapter interface is deliberately overbuilt for what it currently does, because it's staged for a project that, as of this writing, hasn't left my head. No model would arrive at that on its own. A developer with a horizon the model doesn't have access to has to put it there by hand. That correction, the part where a person with a longer horizon than the model's context window steers it toward a future state it has no way of inferring, is precisely what a coding assistant with millions of daily users captures at scale continuously as a byproduct of ordinary use. Not the code that got written, the argument that produced it. Every rejected suggestion is a labeled example of where the model's defaults diverge from what a working system actually requires, and every accepted correction is a labeled example of the fix. That is a training signal you cannot scrape and increasingly can't synthesize, because synthesizing it requires the very thing that's grown scarce: a human being who understands where a system is going and is willing to keep telling the model it's wrong until it isn't. So when the acquisition gets described as XAI buying a text editor, the number sounds absurd, because measured against an editor, it is absurd. Measured against the order flow running underneath it, the accumulating, compounding record of real developers pulling a real model toward real intent at a scale nobody can buy from a vendor or spin up in a data center, 60 billion starts to look like the price of the one input that everyone else is running low on.